On April 27, 2026, a sheriff stood behind a podium in Placer County, California, and said something investigators hadn't been able to say in 34 years. Her name was Cindy Wanner. In November of 1991, she walked into her sister's house to clean it, and she never walked out. A tight, suffocating shot, an 11-month-old child, alone, strapped into a high chair, crying, no mother anywhere in frame. Her shoes were still by the door. Her coat was on the hook. Her car sat in the driveway. There was no blood, no broken glass, no sign that anything had happened at all. She had simply vanished, out of a quiet house, in the middle of the day, leaving her baby behind. It would take 35 years, a stranger's DNA, and facial recognition software running half a continent away to answer the question this town had been asking since 1991. Where did Cindy Wanner go? And who took her? Before she was a case file, Cindy Wanner was a name people in Granite Bay said with affection. A Sacramento native, a wife, a mother of two, a 4-year-old daughter at home, and a baby still small enough to be carried on one hip. She was 35 years old in the fall of 1991. There's no surviving footage of the morning of November 25th. No camera caught her walking through a doorway, no recording of her voice. What we know of that day has been built entirely from what was left behind, and what was left behind would haunt the people who found it for the rest of their lives. Cindy had agreed to help her sister out that day, taking the baby along to clean her sister's house in Granite Bay, a quiet, leafy suburb east of Sacramento. The kind of place where the biggest worry most families had was whether the lake would be warm enough by the weekend. It was an ordinary errand, the kind no one thinks twice about, the kind that, for most families, ends in nothing more than a clean kitchen and a tired toddler. It did not end that way for Cindy's family. When her husband arrived later that day with their 4-year-old daughter, something was wrong before he even reached the front step. The house was too quiet. Inside, the baby was still strapped into the high chair, crying, alone, no one answering her. Cindy's shoes sat by the door, exactly where she'd taken them off. Her coat still hung on its hook. Her car was parked outside, untouched. Cindy herself was gone. There was no broken window, no overturned furniture, no sign of a struggle anywhere in the house. Investigators who walked through that home, in the hours afterward, used a phrase that would follow this case for the next 3.5 decades. The home was largely undisturbed, as if Cindy had simply stepped outside for a moment, and the world had swallowed her whole. By nightfall, the quiet streets of Granite Bay were no longer quiet. Neighbors who had never met Cindy were knocking on doors with flashlights. Deputies fanned out across backyards and creek beds. Her name was being called into the dark by people who, 24 hours earlier, had no idea she existed. For her family, what followed was a particular grinding kind of agony, the agony of not knowing. Every ringing phone might be the call. Every set of headlights in the driveway might be news. Her 4-year-old kept asking when Mommy was coming home. There was no answer that made any sense to give a 4-year-old. 3 weeks would pass before anyone had an answer at all, and the answer, when it finally came, would not bring relief. It would only deepen the mystery, and set in motion a search for a killer that would not end for 35 years. How does a mother of 2 vanish from inside her own family's home, in broad daylight, without a single sign of a struggle? And what happened to her, in the 3 weeks before she was found? A hunter found her, walking through brush in a remote, wooded stretch outside Forest Hill, nearly 40 miles from the home where she'd vanished, deep in terrain bordering the Tahoe National Forest. He came across what investigators had spent 3 weeks searching for: Cindy Wanner, strangled, left in the wilderness like something to be discarded rather than someone to be mourned. For her family, the discovery answered one question and detonated 100 more. She had been found. She was gone. But how? And why like this? What investigators determined next made the case even harder to live with. Cindy had not been killed right away. The evidence suggested she had been kept alive for days after she was taken from her sister's home. Days during which no one knew where she was. Days her 4-year-old spent asking when her mother was coming home. Days that, looking back, her family would spend the rest of their lives trying not to imagine in detail. Whoever did this had taken her without leaving a mark on the house, kept her somewhere for some unknown number of days without a single witness coming forward, and then driven her nearly 40 miles into the hills and left her there, confident, it seemed, that no one would ever trace it back to him. In 1991, DNA testing existed, but only in its infancy. It required large, intact samples to produce anything usable at all. Whatever trace evidence existed on Cindy's body, or at the scene where she'd been found, would have to wait for science to catch up to the crime. No one could say, in 1991, how long that wait might be. Somewhere, the man responsible was walking free, and he would keep walking free for the next 3.5 decades, while a family buried a mother and tried to explain her absence to 2 daughters too young to understand it. The years did what years do. They piled up, one on top of the next, and the world moved on around a family that couldn't. The 1990s gave way to the 2000s. The 2000s gave way to the 2010s. Cindy's daughters grew into adults without her, one too young, when she disappeared to ever really remember her mother's voice, the other carrying a thinning collection of memories that time slowly wore down, the way a river wears down stone. The case never officially closed, it simply went quiet. Detectives rotated in and out of the Placer County Sheriff's Office over the decades, and each new generation inherited the same locked box of evidence and the same unanswered question. Whenever forensic science advanced, the old samples went back to the lab, and every time, for over 30 years, the results came back the same way. Not nothing, just not enough. Every November 25th brought the same ritual, a phone call to the family, an update with no real update inside it. We haven't forgotten her, we're still working it. For some families, a call like that might start to feel hollow after 20 years of repetition. For Cindy's, it was the only proof that somewhere, in an office neither of her daughters had ever visited, someone still cared whether the world would ever know who did this to her. The man responsible, meanwhile, did not vanish into hiding. According to investigators, he simply kept living, moving through Washington, then Oregon, then eventually settling somewhere far from the wooded hills outside Forest Hill, his trail growing as cold behind him as Cindy's case had gone cold in front of the detectives chasing it. What none of them yet knew was that the answer to 34 years of silence had been sitting in an evidence locker the entire time, encoded into a sample too small, too degraded, for any machine in the 20th century to read. It was not a question of finding new evidence. It was a question of waiting for technology to grow powerful enough to finally read the evidence they already had. That moment arrived in the form of one final submission, a single piece of original evidence, sent to a lab that hadn't existed when Cindy disappeared, run through a process her own investigators couldn't have dreamed of in 1991. This time, the science held. A profile came back, and attached to that profile was a name connected to a man who had been released from prison only months before Cindy Wanner vanished from her sister's home. A man with a documented history of breaking into other people's houses and hurting the people inside them. The DNA had finally spoken, but a name on a lab report wasn't an arrest, and the man it pointed to had spent 35 years building a life far from Placer County, with no idea that a single overlooked sample was about to undo all of it. The name on the lab report was James Lawhead Jr. In 1991, he had been 30 years old and free for only a matter of months. Years earlier, in 1980, he had broken into a home and committed sex crimes against a 71-year-old woman and a young girl inside it. He was convicted. He was sentenced to 19 years. He served 11 of them. Lawhead Jr. walked out of prison in early 1991, months before Cindy Wanner disappeared from her sister's home in Granite Bay. A man with a documented history of breaking into houses and hurting the people inside them had been handed his freedom back. Within months, a mother of 2 vanished from a quiet home in broad daylight, without a single sign of struggle, the exact kind of crime scene that had baffled investigators for over 3 decades. A name was not an arrest. He was out there somewhere, living a life built on the assumption that no one was coming. The question was whether they could find him before he ran. A name doesn't tell you where someone is 35 years later. Investigators traced Lawhead Jr.'s movements across decades and state lines, Washington, then Oregon, then finally Arizona, using a tool that didn't exist in 1991. Facial recognition technology, run against decades-old photographs, and whatever recent images existed of a man who had spent half his life trying not to be noticed. It led them to a quiet house in Bullhead City, Arizona, a small desert town along the Colorado River, a world away from the wooded hills outside Forest Hill, where Cindy's body had been left. On Friday, April 24, 2026, detectives moved in. James Lawhead Jr., now 64 years old, was arrested at his home and booked into the Mohave County Jail, facing charges of kidnapping, murder, and being a wanted sex offender. What they found inside that house told its own story. A search warrant turned up multiple loaded firearms staged throughout the home, and a packed bag containing his clothes, $15,000 in cash, and a burner phone. A man, it seemed, who was prepared to disappear the moment he needed to. Had he always known this day might come? And just how many other people had quietly helped him stay hidden for 35 years? The investigation didn't stop with him. Detectives also served a search warrant nearly 400 miles away at a home in San Clemente, California, the residence of his sister, 71-year-old Terry Lawhead. She was arrested not in California, but in Lancaster County, South Carolina, and charged as an accessory to the crime that had haunted Placer County for 35 years. For a family that had waited 3.5 decades for a single name, the case had now produced 2, a brother and a sister, allegedly bound together across the very same span of years Cindy's daughters had spent growing up without her. Placer County Sheriff Wayne Wu stood before the cameras and didn't soften what the system had allowed to happen. He called it one of the most notorious and heinous cold cases his county had ever seen, and said plainly that the system which released Lawhead Jr. after only 11 years of a 19-year sentence was broken, then and now. If Lawhead Jr. had served his full sentence in 1991, would Cindy Wanner still be alive today? And if his sister knew what he'd done, what else might she have helped him hide for 35 years? The arrest closed one case, but it opened a far larger and more uncomfortable question. Detectives began retracing Lawhead Jr.'s movements across the last 20 years, through Washington, Oregon, and Arizona, searching for any sign that Cindy Wanner had not been his only victim. Authorities issued a direct appeal to law enforcement agencies across the West Coast. Look at your own unsolved cases. Look for similarities. Reach out. It is the quiet, unsettling coda so many cold cases share once they're finally solved. The realization that catching one man after 35 years doesn't answer how many other families might still be waiting for a phone call that hasn't come yet. There is a version of this story that ends with handcuffs and a mugshot, with a sheriff at a podium, and a headline that reads, "Case closed with help." But that was never really the story. The story is a 35-year-old mother who took her baby to help her sister clean a house on an ordinary Monday in November. It's a 4-year-old who grew up asking when her mother was coming home and never got an answer that made sense until she was old enough to have children of her own. It's an 11-month-old who has no memory of her mother's voice at all, only a single image other people have had to carry for her, a high chair, and a cry no one came to answer in time. It is also the story of investigators who refused to let a file go quiet just because the years kept passing, who kept sending evidence back to the lab, decade after decade, on nothing but the belief that science would eventually catch up to what they already knew in their gut. 35 years is a long time to wait for an answer. It is not, in the end, too long for an answer to matter. Cindy Wanner never got to watch her daughters grow up. She never got to see the home in Granite Bay become a memory instead of a crime scene. But on the day this case finally broke open, It was her name, not her killer's, that an entire community gathered to say out loud. For a family that spent 35 Novembers without her, that is not nothing. That is, finally, justice catching up to love.